Today, from the oldest state house in America, in Annapolis, Maryland, we have an opportunity to sit and speak candidly with the Governor of Maryland, Wes Moore, and the First Lady, Dawn. Join us for this very special edition of the Armstrong Williams Show. Governor, are we accepting failure as a standard in education?
I will never accept failure as a standard. And that's why I'm calling for greater accountability and greater transparency. There's nothing more important to the future of our state than making sure that we have kids who can read and kids who can do math. If our students aren't able to do the basics of reading and mathematics and really getting to the basics of what our education system is supposed to do, then we're not going to be competitive, and we as a state will continue to fall behind other states. And so there has to be a greater level of accountability and a greater level of transparency, because that's going to produce a greater result, which is what we all are aiming for and what we all hope for.
And where does that accountability lie?
I think the accountability lies with all of us. We all have a shared responsibility to be able to make sure that our children are being prepared for the future. And that includes everyone from the superintendent to local jurisdictions to parents and guardians to village elders to educators to faith leaders to the governor. Everybody must be in the game. We can't pick and choose who's going to be involved in our children's education, because whether you're talking about educators, parents, or the students themselves, everybody's going to have the role to play, and that's why we all have to be engaged.
You know, as a parent, as you away from your role as governor and you talk to your wife about why some kids learn and others don't, what is the pathway from the parent to the classroom, the teachers, and the administrators? What is the best pathway for them to learn and to learn well, to really have a chance at the American dream?
You know, I was a kid who wasn't reading at grade level when I was in third grade. I was a kid who I had handcuffs to my wrists by the time I was 11. I was sent away to a military school because of my behavior when I was 13. And sometimes people will say to me, they're like, well, isn't it great that you got sent away? Isn't it great that you got sent away to military school? And I always say, what happened to me wasn't being physically transported. What happened to me wasn't getting picked up and moved around. What happened to me was I found myself surrounded by people. And first starting with my mom and my grandparents, and leading to this amazing string of role models and teachers and coaches and ministers, and people who taught me that the world was bigger than what was just directly in front of me. But they did it together. My mom wasn't at odds with my teachers. My teachers were not at odds with my minister. They worked together because they had a shared goal, which was, how can we help this young boy become a man of honor and a man of integrity? And so I think when we think about what it is and what is it going to take for all of our children, and again, not just some, all of our children, to be able to have the kind of opportunities that we want for all of our children to have, it means that every single one of us must embrace our personal responsibility in order to make that happen. That we have to make this pathway for all of our children mean something, and we have to give them an opportunity to be able to see it for themselves. If we do that, we're going to get the kind of results that we're looking for.
So what you're speaking of is structure.
Yes.
But many of the parents today who have kids in the classroom are kids themselves. And often what the kids repeat are the examples at home. Obviously, you understand the pathway to learning. But what about those that never have the example of learning, of reading, of writing, of going to the library, of being respectful in the classroom?
We can't leave them behind. Because if we leave them behind, that is going to hurt our entire society. We have so many children in our communities, in our society right now, that are coming up in conditions that they're not responsible for. They were born into that. That we have children that were born into circumstances that we would not wish upon our worst enemies. And so it does become our collective responsibility to be each other's brothers and sisters keepers.
But teachers would say often, and while many people would agree on your point, that sometimes that lack of structure and respect, sometimes they're injured, they're slapped, they are ousted, so much to the point there's so much violence where the teachers themselves don't want to be in the classroom because it's no longer an environment to teach.
That's right. But I think part of what we have to do is making sure that we're creating the kind of educational environments that make it a hospitable environment for educators. One thing I believe in deeply, when we passed the Educator Shortage Act this year, one of the first bills that I introduced and one of the first bills that I signed about how are we encouraging and incentivizing people to raise their hand to teach. One of the biggest things we learned was this, is that there are certain things you can do in terms of financial incentives, right? That you can provide bonuses for teachers and that type of thing. But you cannot just stop there. It is not just about just financial incentives. How are you making the environment better? How are you making it a more hospitable environment for people to want to teach inside of some of the most challenging urban or rural
But how do you
communities?
address the violence in the school, those kids with that consistent behavior?
Well, you have to be able to start where the ecosystem of the violence oftentimes comes from, and that's the neighborhoods and that's the households, where what you are seeing oftentimes inside of school, that is the end result.
But how do we, and I understand what you're saying, but how do we address the fact that they're in the classroom and they're very disruptive? How do we create an environment for those that are there to learn?
Well, you have to make sure that if you have disruptive entities within classrooms, communities, et cetera, that they have to be dealt with because they're going to need specific support.
What is your definition of dealt with?
Well, I think you have to find ways of being able to remove and provide consistent supports.
And remove them from that environment.
Because it's not just about what is the impact that disruption is having on everyone around them, right? It's also about there are going to be specific needs that individuals are going to have. And we have to be prepared to provide specific needs for individuals. So this isn't just about the idea of, well, it's hurting everyone around them. That cry for help has got to be dealt with help and support.
Do you think the classrooms in the school itself need more resource officers?
Yeah, I think the school resource officers on the local jurisdictions, where the local jurisdictions, have, and you look in the state of Maryland, where we have SROs and school resource officers who are dealing with situations on the local level. And I think local jurisdictions have the authority to be able to do that. But I think that local jurisdictions need to have the authority to be able to put the specific pieces in place that are going to be most beneficial and also most targeted for their own individual local jurisdiction.
So you're saying they should be allowed to do their jobs?
Yeah, I think the local jurisdictions have a responsibility to do their jobs.
And I don't want to misinterpret your quote. When you were elected, you made a statement to the teachers union that they had a friend in Maryland. And sometimes the teachers union agenda come at the expense of the child because sometimes it's a one size fit all. And you as a parent knows that no kid learns the same. You've got to find a way to make that kid enthusiastic about education, enthusiastic about learning. And so it requires a lot of attention. So I don't want to interpret that to mean that they had a friend in you at the expense of the parent and the student. And I just want you to explain what you meant by that. And how do you balance the two?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Where our educators, they do have a friend in me, but so do our parents, and so do our students. I don't give way to the false choice. You know, and one thing I always say is, listen, I'm new to politics. You know, I didn't come from a political family. I don't come from a political background. I was an Army officer, led soldiers in combat. I ran a business. I ran one of the largest poverty fighting organizations in this country. And oftentimes when I would hear people make this dichotomy about, are you with educators or are you with parents? The only people I was hearing that from were politicians. Because when I was talking with families, none of them talked like that. That's not how we came up. And so do our educators know that they have me as a friend? Yeah, they do. And they know they have my ear, and they know that this is, as we've heard from educators in Maryland, this is the first time in 8 years that educators have actually met with the governor.
Define for us in terms of policy, in terms of an advocacy, what does it mean when the governor says, I am a friend of parents and children in the classroom?
It means that they are always going to have my ear and they're always going to have my heart. It means that whether we are speaking with a parent in Westminster or a parent in West Baltimore, that you know that you have a governor who hears you, who takes your situation seriously, and is going to invest in your future and in the future of your child. And I see that as a prime responsibility for why I'm in this seat.
What happens though if you've given superintendents and principals and administrators an opportunity to provide for the students? Because I mean, it's not lost on Baltimore that they have 23 schools and not one kid is proficient in math, in English, and reading. That is certainly an indictment of leadership. When does it get to the point when you've given people so many opportunities to deliver for the students and the parents, where the governor says someone needs to be removed, something has to change?
Well, I'm a big believer in accountability, and I always have been my entire career. Accountability and transparency. And you know, there is nobody who is more infuriated about the idea that we have children who are not getting the education that they deserve, and that we have a constitutional responsibility to be able to provide, than me. And so I know that when we look at a situation that we have now, where not every child in our state is getting the same educational supports, and we have to address that. No one is okay with this. And I say, to include the superintendent, but no one is okay with this. And I demand greater accountability. I demand better results. I demand more transparency. And I know the state of Maryland demands more accountability and transparency.
If that does not happen, heads will roll.
Oh, absolutely. We need to have people who are going to move and take this seriously. The educational success of our children cannot be compromised, because everything about our future relies on that. And if you look at the investments that we have made in public education, if you look at the people who I have had the opportunity in just our first months to appoint to the board, these are education reformers. These are people who believe in accountability.
I want to come back to that, because that's going to lead me to a conversation about childry and school choice. I'm Armstrong Williams. The governor of Maryland, Wes Moore, is our guest, and we'll be back. Welcome back.
Thank you.
To the broadcast. You know, obviously, there are many parents out of desperation that support choice in education. Because the last thing a parent wants to see is that their child is not able to learn and progress in the educational apparatus. And why do you think parochial schools and Catholic schools, they don't have any of the issues with teacher disrespect? They operate on far less money, and they produce far better results. And they also have some of the best teachers. Why can't we have that in public education?
Well, I think we can have that in public education. I think we must demand it. We must demand high quality public schools, period and full stop. And you know, it's not just the reason that I support high quality charter schools, high quality community schools, because these are public schools. And it's also the reason that I have shown that you are not going to find a bigger champion for public schools of all forms and all types, for all of our kids, than what you're seeing with our administration.
So that's included parochial school choice. You see that as a part of public education.
Oh, I have a laser focus on making sure that we have a world-class public school education, a public school system in this state, because nothing in our state is going to move unless we have a world-class public school system. And that will include community schools, that will include charter schools, that will include the fact that we have to make investments in our schools. You know, if you look at our first budget, the first budget we laid out, we made historic investments in our public school system. Over $8 billion went towards public schools of all types.
Of that money, because I know people toss out figures, but I want you to, for the listener to understand how that money is impacting education.
Yeah, well, you know, before I ran for governor, I ran one of the largest poverty fighting organizations in this country. And we could tell you to the dollar what was going to be the return on that. I believe deeply in measurements of accountability, and that this is not just about, what are we going to fund, but are there actually going to be deliverable results for the funding that we're able to push forward, and how are you able to show that that was the best investment? And so when you look at the investments that we made to do things that are proven, that are working, for example, things like making sure that we can start school earlier, where 80% of brain development happens in a child by the time that child is 5 years old. So why we have school systems that are starting children at 5 makes absolutely no sense. So much of brain development has already happened by that point. The fact that we made historic investments in things like career technical education and job training and trade programs and apprenticeship programs. Because I tell you, I'm proud of the fact that we have some of the best 4-year schools in the country, in the state of Maryland. But I want to be very clear, we are going to end this myth that every single one of our students have to attend one of them in order to be economically successful.
But it sounds as though you're also saying, for those that maybe college is not their pathway, technical schools and learning other skills where they can create opportunities and have real skills in the job market.
That's exactly right. And I want them to know that it is not a deficiency or a deficit if you choose not to go to a 4-year school. You know, listen, I think about my own path. Right? I was a non-traditional student. At 17 years old, I joined the Army. I first started my collegiate career at a 2-year college. In fact, that's the ring that I wear from my 2-year college. And I tell people, I was not the traditional student, but because I was offered pathways to make my life what it is that I wanted to make of it, I was able to now sit in the governor's conference room as the 63rd governor of this state and have this conversation with you as a 2-year college graduate and as a person who joined the Army when I was 17 years old, right? So I want to make sure that all of our students, every single one of them, have a pathway to economic success, and that attending a 4-year school does not have to be a prerequisite or something that every single student needs to do in order to be successful.
You know, this is the sadness of this question. It does seem disproportionately this education disaster impacts brown children more than anyone else. And you look at a place like Baltimore, which should be a crown jewel. The superintendent is Black. The city councils, the mayor, I mean, it's run by what they would say a chocolate city. But yet, these kids are failing. If these were, let's say, as we would say the old Jim Crow, we would expect the Ku Klux Klan to put this kind of program in place, and continue this kind of program to keep people ignorant, put them behind, and always dependent on the government. But it's not. We spent so many years in the civil rights movement electing people. Is it less about race now and more about changing the bureaucracy? Because it's these kids, and not just in Baltimore, but all across the country, these Black and brown kids are being destroyed through the educational system. They're just not, the administrators are just not accountable. And you and Don would not allow that to happen to your son and daughter as a parent.
And these are our children.
Yes.
They're our children. And we need to treat them as such. And so so when we talk about everything that needs to be done and creating an environment, both the environment in the house, the environment in the neighborhood, and the environment in the schools, that every single one of our children need and deserve to be successful, that's what we need to be prepared to invest in every single aspect. So when people say to me, they're like, well, how does poverty and inequality show itself? And I tell people in every way, in the air people are breathing, in the water they're drinking. We still have children who cannot drink from the water fountains in their schools. From the transportation assets they have or don't have, the fact that it sometimes will take students, it'll take students over an hour and a half to go 2 miles on public transportation. The reason why we made investments in things like the Red Line and bringing back East-West transit inside of Baltimore. The reason that we made historic investments in things like housing supports, because the #1 driver of poverty in the state of Maryland is housing insecurity. The reason that we can focus on being able to have full-on wraparound supports for our children, over $100 million invested in behavioral and mental health supports. Because when people say, how does this show itself? The challenge is that inequality and poverty does not pick and choose. It's like water. It floods everywhere where there's a hole. And that's how we have to address it. And the reason that we have to invest in every single aspect of our children's future is because the things that are hurting their future is not picking and choosing. It's hitting them in every single way.
You know, Chaudhry, the superintendent, I read a lot of Project Baltimore's investigations, not only on Chaudhry, but the educational system here in Baltimore. And I know he's not your appointee. He was appointed by Governor Hogan. You only have 4 appointees on the board. And but if there's a clear example of someone, and this is not my opinion, this is talking to many people preparing for this sit down with you. It's a classic example that his contract should not be renewed. Whether you have say-so over that or not, his policies have failed the students.
Well, and I'd say, and he actually wasn't appointed by my predecessor because the governor doesn't appoint, which is part of the problem. The governor doesn't appoint the school superintendent, nor does the school superintendent report to the governor. That the school superintendent reports to 2 different boards, which are comprised of different members, even though only one of the boards has higher authority for the superintendent. So I can't even say that my predecessor appointed him because he did not. This is an independent body. And part of my frustration is this idea that I believe in accountability. I need to know who is responsible. And when I ask a question, I'm not asking for 5 people to give me an answer. Who is the person that I need to get that answer from?
Doesn't it start with the titular head, the superintendent?
Well, I think the superintendent, absolutely. And the superintendent has an incredibly important job to be able to really foster and bring all these systems together. And listen, the superintendent is a brilliant man. And the superintendent.
What do you base brilliancy on?
Well, I think
of the Baltimore schools?
I think he's a very talented educator.
Maybe he should be brilliant somewhere else.
I think he's a very talented educator. I also
talented based on his results.
No, I'm as an educator.
Okay.
But what I also know is this: the results we have right now in the state of Maryland, they are unsatisfactory.
It's good to hear you say that. And let me ask you a pointed question. If you had to make the decision, if it were your decision alone, though it's not, to renew his contract, would you?
Well, it's to your point, it's not my decision.
But if it were your decision, I'm asking a different question. If it were your decision, would you renew his contract? You just said accountability, transparency is critical.
And these results are not where they need to be, and no one can argue that they are. And I would argue no one can argue to include the superintendent. What I also know is this, though, that this is not about personality.
No.
This is about performance. The performance should speak for itself.
How difficult is it for you? And you, like you said, you're not a politician. You're not even the favorite person of Maryland when you ran for governor.
That's right.
But you won by the will of the people. How difficult is it for you to get the legislature in this state to do something about education and change this dismal trajectory?
Well, the legislature has an important role to play in all of this. The legislature is the one who created the structure that we have for education. And I will work with the legislature, and I will work with anybody who is committed to making sure that our kids can get a better education and making sure that we can get a world-class education for every single one of our students. I will work with anybody who has that as their focus and know that that's going to be my focus as well, and we're working in partnership. And I enjoy working with the legislature on this. I also know that we have to work with the legislature in order to make this happen, and we have got to make it a priority, because we cannot have a 21st century economy that's moving if we do not have a 21st century education system that is preparing our students for those type of results. If you look at what's happening right now in Maryland's economy, where our economy is falling behind other states, that if you look at economic growth that's happened in our economy in the state of Maryland over the past, from 2018 to 2022, our economy has grown by 0.3%. It's basically the same size as it was 4 years ago. Pennsylvania's economy, our neighbor, their economy is $22 billion larger. The national economy has grown by 7.5% over that same time period, while we have grown by 0.3. We are falling behind.
It sounds as though you're going to change this.
100%. And that's why I ran for governor.
Hold that. Governor Wes Moore is our guest. I'm Armstrong Williams, and we'll be back. Welcome back to the broadcast. Are you a law and order governor?
I'm a get stuff done governor. I joined the Army when I was 17 years old. I led soldiers in combat. Some of the bravest men and women I've ever met in my life are people who have worn a uniform. People who intentionally ran towards danger when the human instinct is to run away from it. And I will always have a permanent debt of gratitude to them. And when you look at what we have done even in our first months as governor, made historic investments in local law enforcement, $122 million towards local law enforcement, $17.5 million towards Baltimore City alone. Just recently made another investment of $6 million to making sure that we're recruiting and retaining law enforcement, local law enforcement.
So it sounds as though funding police is a priority, and the funding is just senseless.
Well, no, but it's past funding. Law enforcement know that I have their back, because it's past just this idea of making sure that we're funding local law enforcement or funding the Maryland Coordination Analysis Center, which I did a historic number of at over $11 million, which is the governor's main tool for intelligence sharing and coordination. It's also making sure that we're not asking law enforcement to do everything. That if you are not funding neighborhoods and communities, and you're just asking law enforcement to go and clean up the debris that comes from broken communities, then you can't claim that you support law enforcement. If you support law enforcement, what that means is making sure that we have the tools and the training and the mechanisms and the recruiting tools and everything else that's going to make us the most efficient force, that you can have law enforcement that moves with appropriate intensity and absolute integrity, by making sure we're filling these vacancies. Right now in Baltimore City, there's over 500 vacancies of police officers. So we've got to make sure we're filling these vacancies and getting law enforcement the supports that they need. But also, we cannot ask law enforcement to do everything in our neighborhoods, because we continue to not support and under-resource communities and then ask law enforcement to then go ahead and clean everything up. That's not fair to them. And that's not going to help them make it home.
You know, in speaking to law enforcement, it won't surprise you what their greatest concern is juvenile crime and juvenile accountability and supervision. that they make an arrest and the person's back on the street within a week, and they just throw their hands in the air. How do you, as governor, with the legislature, which can pass laws to change this mindset and these policies, what can you do about this juvenile crime?
Well, I tell you, we are, and I will continue working in partnership with the legislature. We have got to make the adjustments necessary that there can be real measurements and levels of accountability. That you cannot have systems where people can feel that they can violate and repeatedly violate the law, and particularly these violent offenders, and think that there is no punishment awaiting them. That will not stand. And I will work with the legislature and work with and we already are working with the legislature and local law enforcement to be able to make those adjustments. And really what we've been focusing on is greater measurements of coordination.
You just said something. I gotta take a breather. You're saying that these juveniles must be held accountable.
And I'll say it again. People have to be held to account for their decisions. And there can be no equivocation of this. And one thing that we see is when we're talking about holding people to account, and I say, we have to invest in neighborhoods. We have to invest in communities. We have to make sure we're creating additional opportunities and pathways for everyone who lives in our communities. But when you have a person who is a repeat violent offender, I'm sorry, I'm coming after you. And we have to. But we have to have greater measurements of coordination about what that means and what it looks like.
And that's why you work with your strategic partners like law enforcement.
It's law enforcement, but it's not just law enforcement,
yes.
Right? It's also the fact that we're watching greater levels of coordination now in the first 8 months of our administration than we have seen in 8 years, working with the state's attorney's office, working with the U.S. attorney, working with our federal partners to making sure that we are getting and keeping these violent offenders off of our streets, to making sure that we are getting and keeping these illegal guns out of our neighborhoods. And I can tell you right now, the level of coordination that we have shown and the level of partnership that we have shown, while we are not done and I am not going to be satisfied, you're actually starting to see results where around the state, we have watched the number of homicides and watched the number of non-fatal shootings drop. If you look at Baltimore City alone, the work that we've done in coordination with the U.S. attorney and the state's attorney and the attorney general and local law enforcement, that we've been able to drive the homicide rate now in Baltimore is down around 25%. We've been able to lower the rate of non-fatal shootings down. And again, this is going after 8 straight years in the state of Maryland, where we have seen the homicide rate nearly double in the past 8 years. The rate of non-fatal shootings in the state of Maryland has doubled in the past 8 years. Baltimore City has had 8 straight years of 300 plus homicides.
More than half of the state.
That's exactly right. And we have got, and the reason that we move so aggressively, and the reason that we have taken an all of the above approach is saying that I need to make sure that people are going to be held accountable for their crimes. But also, we cannot just simply be reactive to violent crime. We've got to make sure we're stopping violent crime before it happens.
Let me share something that's almost unfathomable to me. Since January of this year to August, there have been over 5,000 carjackings.
Yeah.
Carjacking. How do you send a message? And some of these kids are 11 years old.
Yes.
How do you send them? And do you understand? It seems as though when you read these stories, it's always about sympathy for the criminal. And to me, they're criminals. But what about the victim? Does someone ever think about how disruptive that is to the victim's life, walking out 3 o'clock in the morning or walking out at midday, and where you park your car is no longer there because it's been hijacked?
And all the victims need to know that we have got to continue moving aggressively on this. So I was speaking to someone the other day, and they were talking about this, the reality that carjackings are actually down 35% from what we saw last year. And they said, that must feel pretty good. I said, why? Because if you have a single person getting their carjacked, we got work to do. So you cannot look at the fact that we have carjackings down and simply say that that's enough for success. We have got to keep pushing. We got to keep getting creative. We got to make sure that we are aggressive. We got to make sure we're holding people to account for it. We've got to use technology and technology that's readily available now for us to be able to both intersect these rings, because oftentimes these are organized crime rings that are also involved in this type of work. We cannot stop being aggressive on this, even if we've had measurements of improvement from last year. That's not enough.
How do you, because this, just the psychological impact of the carjacking, you got your insurance, the impact that it just disrupts your life.
That's right.
And then it also gives you a certain kind of fear. But talk about, when you read these stories, particularly throughout Maryland, where these kids go into these high-end stores, they go into also go into Walmarts, and they just steal, and there's no accountability. It seems to me that the focus is always on the criminals. And I call them criminals because that's what they are. But what about the business owners who bust their chops to try to create opportunities, jobs? They put their products on the shelves. They open their doors. It is their livelihood. They put everything in there. And then you read these stories where some of them are having to shut down because no one seems to tell these thugs that this is unacceptable, Governor.
Well, yeah, and we also have to remember these business owners, for many of them, they are the economic engine of our society. They're the ones who are hiring people. They're the ones who are providing people benefits. They're the ones who are, I remember, my mother got her first job that gave her benefits when I was 14 years old. That job that she got, that didn't just change her life. That changed the trajectory of our family. And so we're talking about business owners who during COVID kept their doors open even when they didn't have to. We're talking about business owners who during COVID kept people on payroll, kept paying them, even when they told people it's better or safer for you not to come to work. So there are remarkable sacrifices that our business leaders and our entrepreneurs are making. Businesses who are building up communities and building up their businesses in communities that need economic support, and they're choosing to go inside those communities. And so we have to ensure that this partnership that we have with the business community, the partnership that we have with entrepreneurs, the partnership that we have with CEOs, making sure that they know that this is going to be a community and this is going to be an environment that sees them, that supports them, that makes sure that they can do their business in a measurement of safety, and also all the other assets that CEOs are coming to me every day and talking about. We have to create more opportunities for people in the communities that we're working in. We have to create more transportation assets for the communities that we're in so we can get a greater sense of commerce and people moving around. We have to fix up the housing involved because we want people who are living close to our businesses. All the CEOs are basically saying is, be our partner inside of this work. And that's exactly what we are providing, is that measure of partnership, because these business leaders, and again, before I decided to run for office, I was a small business owner. So I take this personally, and we're taking that mindset into the work that we're actually getting done in this moment.
Governor Flythe Moore is our guest. Coming up later in the show, the First Lady of Maryland will also join us. I'm Armstrong Williams, and we'll be back. Welcome back. We're joined by the First Lady of Maryland. First Lady Moore, when you and I and the governor were growing up and our families were intact, and our grandparents, we didn't have social media and the internet, it seems as though with today's generation, the world we're in today, we stepped off to a whole new planet. How do parents navigate the new reality that we face with so much that compete for our children's mind and control?
I think we still have to stick with our family values. We have to keep our families together. We have to stay involved with our children's lives. Wes and I have clearly taken on a new role, which we're really privileged to be in, but we have two beautiful children who we can't fall by the wayside. And so while we hope to be examples for them, we try to keep their lives as normal as possible. And normal for them is mommy and daddy still playing in the front yard with the football. Mommy and daddy taking them to get ice cream. Mommy and daddy helping them with homework. And so, you know, to the extent that parents can do that, that's what we have to continue to do that. We can't allow social media to parent our children. And we have to be able to tap into our village. Our mothers are very, very helpful with our children. And those are the women that we lean on in our family and our friends. So social media has its place, but it's not to be in place of parents raising their children.
You know, when we're coming along, accountability, discipline, when we did something wrong, our parents kept us in check. Sometimes it was a whipping. Parents don't whip their kids like they did in the old days. But how do you make kids understand that they're accountable and responsible?
Well, you know, my mother-in-law says something that's so beautiful. She says that children have to think that you care before they care what you think. And children start out beautiful and perfect as far as I'm concerned. And I think sometimes adults get in and mess things up. And I think what we have to show our children is that they are our future, that they mean the world to us, and that we love them. And we're not going to always be perfect. Wes and I don't say we're perfect parents, but we're always doing the best that we can do. And when we don't know what to do, we tap into our village. And I think there are many parents in many communities who are doing that every single day. We can tell the bad stories about what's happening in communities, but there are parents who we do a disservice to because there are so many who are working so hard in the most difficult circumstances to raise their children.
You know, I know you heard my line of questions to your husband about crime and education. You know, you're a very accomplished person. Education has made it possible for you both to be the first family of Maryland. But one of the things that we did not talk about was the fact that many of these kids that find themselves in sexual trafficking, prostituting, petty crimes, is that the school system failed them and they don't have real skills, real self-esteem. And so they feel it is the only thing that they can do.
Well, I reject that.
Please.
I really do. I reject that. I don't think that children, because they are maybe not in the best environments or that the school system needs to improve, and I think my husband has been very clear about the importance of accountability, that they're going to turn to sexual trafficking, for example. Those are things that adults are doing to children. And I think we have to be very careful about who we place blame on. And I look at, you know, the environments that our children are in. As First Lady, it is my hope that I can support my husband in the work that he's doing for all Marylanders. For example, you know, he's put record numbers into education. He put $100 million into combating the mental health crisis. I think there is a serious mental health crisis that is plaguing our communities, our children. So there are many things that we have to look at. I think if we constantly go to place blame on individuals, I think as Marylanders, right, as Christians, when we are to be our brother and sister's keepers, we are not doing what we have been asked to do. When my husband ran on Leave No One Behind, that is based in a faith around love thy neighbor as you love as yourself. Be your brother and sister's keeper. And that's the value that we have to live by. That's the value that Wes and I live by. And that to me is what he uses to govern every single day.
And that is the community that is often forgotten. Each one bring one. Each one teaches one. I am my brother's keeper. How do we remind people of that virtue? Because you know what? I think your point is very insightful. But how do we reignite this?
I think that we have to be very careful about always focusing on the negative things that are happening. The one thing I love about my husband is that he is honest and real about the importance of accountability. What he has never done, personally or professionally, is make people feel bad about who they are. He gives people hope in what they can accomplish. And that's because he has the lived experience to understand what that hope meant for him. When people believed in him, that made him want to work harder. That made him want to accomplish the things that people could see in him. So in my mind, we have to continue to support people. We have to lift people up. We can badger people and tell them that they're not doing this right and we have to do this better. And sometimes those things work, but you can also make people feel bad about their place in life. But it is amazing what you can do when you tell somebody, I'm giving you a hand up, not a handout. I'm supporting you in the things that you want to accomplish, because we all want the same things. We want the best places for our children to grow up in. We want the best schools. There's no community throughout Maryland, from Western Maryland to Baltimore to Prince George's County to Montgomery County, that wants anything different for their children. They just want the opportunities to be able to raise their families the way that they want their families to live.
You know, it was not overlooked when you just mention your faith, Christianity. People make these assumptions, stereotypes, but you're so comfortable with yourself. You talk about the fact that faith is very important to you and your family.
Absolutely. Look, we understand the separation between church and state, but there's no doubt that our faith guides us in our public service.
Governor?
I say, first of all, I know God is real because he blessed me with the best wife I could ever have. But she's absolutely right. And it is true. I mean, even though I know I'm new to politics, I do understand the separation of church and state, but there is no doubt in my mind who woke me up this morning. There's no doubt in my mind who's going to put me to bed tonight. There's no doubt in any of our minds the foundation that we stand on, and that because we are rooted in a measurement of faith, because we're rooted in a measurement of not a blind faith, but in a proven one, that we are God's children. All of us are, and so it really does help us to center on the fact that if we're all God's children, then that means by definition we're brothers and sisters.
I like the fact that you're telling us to find the light in darkness, because I think what you're also conveying is that we're not as divided as the media, social media, makes us want to believe that we are, because you see people around you every day that does not fit into that narrative.
That's right. I mean, look, when my husband just spent the day in Brooklyn and Baltimore, and I had the opportunity to go with him some weeks ago. And those people, as brokenhearted as they were, and absolutely have the right to be, they said about my husband to me, I believe him when he says what he says. And that's so powerful. And I've always said my husband is a promise keeper. I never feel more safe with anyone like I feel when I'm with my husband. And I want Marylanders to know that they have a leader who gets up every single day thinking about them, who is going to crisscross this state more than any other person ever has, so that he can meet people where they are, so he can stay connected to them, so he can understand their pain and understand the things that they want to accomplish. He will never lose sight of that.
And what about you as the First Lady?
You know, I feel that this is such a privilege. I worked in government 20-something years ago. I worked for previous administrations. I never imagined that I would be the First Lady of this state. But we say you have plans and God has plans, right? And I'm so proud to be in this position. And I look at the First Lady's office and I look at myself as a connector and a convener. There's so many organizations, there's so many people that need a voice to sort of lift their work up. And I see myself as the person who can help them do that. And so I'm spending my time going around the state, meeting with organizations and finding out what's important to Marylanders. And of course, always the work that my husband is doing, I'm a champion of that work. I believe in the things that he has set forth for Marylanders. And so anytime that I'm able to support him in that, I do it.
And can I just say one more quick thing too? The example that she sets around the state is so powerful, where I watch the impact that her presence makes on young kids, on young girls, on young boys, on everybody who see, that this is a person who, grew up, as the daughter of an entrepreneur with a high school education, and a union worker, and a mom who spent 40 years in the classroom, who went to the University of Maryland, graduated with honors in the University of Maryland, and has devoted her entire life to public service. The inspiration that she sets for our entire state, it is so amazingly powerful.
What the First Lady reminds us of tonight, as we thank them for joining us for this very special edition, is that maybe democracy is not dying. Because the best part of our democracy are just everyday people that you never see in the headlines, you don't see in the daily papers. They just go about taking care of their communities, doing for others where they need to do it. And we need to be reminded that sometimes the media doesn't always come close to telling the whole story. I cannot thank you both enough for joining us tonight. And it has really been an honor for me as a broadcaster. I appreciate the trust, Governor, you gave in sitting down with us, you and your wife tonight. I'm Armstrong Williams, and thank you for joining us for this edition of the Armstrong Williams Show.